pretty well publicized order, I think not coincidentally, on the 4th of July that I'm sure many of you read about, a judge in Louisiana pointing to an extremely intense and, to use his word, relentless campaign by various government officials. And by the way, this is a transpartisan point because this pattern began in the Trump administration, has continued in the Biden administration, and I believe unless there is continued judicial invalidation, whoever occupies the levers of power in the future, regardless of political party or who the individual is going to continue to put enormous pressure on private sector companies to do the government's bidding, to take down as disinformation or otherwise supposedly dangerous speech that is inconsistent with the policies of a particular administration or government officials. What was most chilling about all of those communications, hundreds of them, documented in the judge's order, was there was an express acknowledgement that the speech was constitutionally protected. Government itself would have been barred from directly suppressing any of that information. So the government was doing an end run around its First Amendment obligations by pressuring the private sector entities to do that. And let me give you the one example that I found the most chilling of all the many chilling examples of chilling free speech was any communication that government policies regarding COVID were raising civil liberties concerns. This is going to create vaccine hesitancy, and therefore anybody dares to raise civil liberties concerns, that has to be taken down as dangerous speech.
Well, we're talking about censorship, right? So, I mean, after I actually changed my last name to Freedom, so I started to ask myself this question: are we really free in this country? Because the more so after I got fired from the NBA because of the things that I said about China and their human rights abuses, right? I started to realize that the NBA is not the only one. So we're talking about censorship, and the more I realized, I was like, listen, NBA is not the only one. There are Hollywood is out there, the big tech, the academias, the frontlands, so there are many other things out, Wall Street actually, Congress and local congresses, some of them, but I started to realize that it's just getting interesting because now, if you're in a Hollywood movie, I'm sure you guys watched Top Gun, and the guy had a Taiwan jacket on his back and had a Taiwanese logo and stuff, and he was banned many places. Or I believe he was John Cena, I'm sure you guys know John Cena, and he called Taiwan a country, and he was getting criticized from all over the world, and he had to publicly apologize from the Chinese government and say that I did not mean that in Mandarin, actually. So it's, we're talking about censorship. I mean, I keep asking this question to myself. And the biggest dictatorship in the world, China, can fire a U.S. citizen and from a 100% American-made company. So I feel like this is the biggest censorship that I know.
Our topic is thought police for this hour here. Again, if people have questions, the great Charles Santini from Free to Choose Network is probably going to start wandering through the audience with a microphone asking for questions. But I did want to continue along that concept of thought police, by the way, because I think that also leads to self-censorship. I think that's one of the topics you were starting to get to. So you got the government wall censorship, but then the self-censorship component. And how does that play into it in terms of government censorship?
Okay. Well, I mean, we have a huge problem with self-censorship. I think it's most studied on college campuses. Probably most of you have read the very chilling statistics that 80% of college students self-censor themselves some of the time, and 20% a lot of the time. And what we have when we have self-censorship is, people are scared to discuss the most important ideas of the day, the ideas that are most worthy of discussion, because they're scared of ramifications, whether it's from their peers or from their professors or from higher powers than that. And we create, I think it actually contributes to the extreme polarization that we're seeing in the country. People are not communicating with one another partly because they're scared to, and it really contributes to a lack of sort of civil discourse and civility in this country too.
Even though Joanne and I are both law professors, we have a very robust concept of free speech that goes beyond the legal concept. I think in this country, in fairness, we have very speech protective First Amendment law that by and large is supported at the highest level by the United States Supreme Court. But legal protection against government censorship is necessary but not sufficient to really enjoy free speech. And when you look at those surveys, which exist not only on college campus but throughout society more generally, why is it that people are self-censoring, not in the positive sense of editing to make your communication more effective and more respectful, but in the negative sense of not conveying a certain idea at all, or worse yet, not addressing a certain topic at all? People say that they are self-censoring not because they're afraid that they're going to get arrested, not because on campus they're afraid that a professor is going to punish them, but rather they are afraid of their peers. Students are afraid of other students. They are afraid of being shamed and shunned and ostracized. And that's not something we have a legal solution for. And that's not something I think professors or anybody else can provide a top-down solution. We have to somehow nurture that free speech culture from among students themselves. And FIRE is doing a wonderful job in trying to encourage those free speech, and you've got free speech, young free speech advocates here, including the young man who interviewed you so well yesterday. We have to give all the support we can to them.
I'll give an example actually from my teammates. So, I mean, when I had a conversation with my teammates in a locker room, obviously they have a lot of things to say, but they're scared. You know, they're scared of being canceled. Now every time you give an interview, you tweet something, you say anything, the media pick and choose, and then the one word, they take it, and they put it everywhere and say, oh, Enes is this, Enes is that, whatever. And a lot of my teammates actually are scared to say anything other than basketball because they know that, you know, they might get canceled. They just don't want to deal with that because once you start some people attacking you, then your endorsement will be canceled, or you'll be shamed, or, you know, so people are definitely scared, so we definitely need to cancel culture, for sure.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I run a civil discourse program through the Liberty and Law Center where we get students to talk to one another about the most controversial issues of the day, whether that's guns or abortion or whatever, and we match them up with students who are ideologically different than themselves. And we do surveys at the end, and one of the things that we're getting feedback, I mean, the most common is great, which is that they realize they have much more in common than they would have ever thought. But the one that's really concerning is that they will express, they're really grateful that we provided them an opportunity to engage in this way because they don't feel like they can outside of this specific, like, safe environment, essentially.
Let me reverse question. I'm going to add one more to that first. In my town, it's the parents afraid to speak because their children say, you're going to make it worse for us at school. Our rule on questions, by the way, is really, really simple. If you need more than one sentence to set up your question, then you get the hook. All right, so your right to free speech actually ends the moment you try to take the room hostage with that microphone.
My question is for Joanne. You may have, I hope, unintentionally contributed to the atmosphere of fear with your opening comments. You stated that speech can cause harm. I have never encountered speech that had arms, legs, or weapons, so I would like for you to give an example of speech causing harm.
I mean, I think there's, it can cause emotional harm, and maybe I should have been more specific, but I do think that that can be harmful. for people. It isn't this. I would never equate speech to physical violence, which I think is what you're getting at. And speech is not violence, and those arguments that it is, I think, are very concerning.
I'm curious where you see the greater threat to free speech right now, whether it's from government censors or informal self-censorship.
I personally think the greatest harm is coming not from the government, because there are legal remedies against government censorship. Yes, there is plenty. For example, certain legislation in Florida, which is making it a crime to discuss, even in campus settings, important topics, including race and gender. Yet FIRE and the ACLU and others have been able to get injunctions against those kinds of government censorship. I think the more difficult problem is both the mixed government and private, and then the completely private, because there is no legal solution.
It's never surprised me that government wants to limit speech. What's astounded me is that academia and the news media voluntarily joins this crowd. And when we talk about peer pressure, teenagers don't come up with this. The idea comes from someplace, and it may find a welcome home, but where does this pressure originate someplace?
By the way, that man is on my board of directors. I'll let him have an extra sentence.
My question is for Enes Freedom. I know.
The first,
Oh, sorry.
we were being so
Wait,
polite as to who would answer first, but 2 points. Number one, this is not a recent phenomenon, and I think it's really important for us to know that. So John Stuart Mill's on liberty. Having said that, I have to wear my favorite prop here. I don't know if you can all see this back there, but it doesn't say what you think it says. It says make J.S. Mill great again. So his wonderful work on liberty in 1859, which I think still stands the test of time as the greatest defense of free speech, he expressly says at the very beginning, the biggest problem is not government censorship. It is peer pressure. It is social pressure. Go back even earlier to Alexis de Tocqueville, 1835, visiting the United States, writing his famous Democracy in America. And he said, what I'm really concerned about here is the adverse impact of populism, of popular government, that there is going to be so much social pressure, so much community pressure against free speech. So I think we have to recognize that there is a long history of these problems. As to what has caused the most recent manifestations, including on campus, I think the best explanation continues to be, for me, what was put forth by Greg Lukianoff and John Haidt in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And they mention 5 different factors. By the way, their evidence, which they continue to update on the FIRE website, shows, contrary to the assumption that students are coming to campus and being indoctrinated by woke, progressive faculty members, that the students, to the contrary, come to campus, arrive at campus with those sensorial tendencies. And there's a lot of evidence that this is being inculcated in the K through 12 levels. Greg and John posit the influence of parents, of helicopter parents. John in particular talks a lot about social media and the enormous pressure that creates, especially on adolescent girls. So I think the explanations are complicated, and look for the sequel to Coddling, which is coming out in November. We'll provide more answers.
But why isn't this offset when you get to university?
Does he go so far as to get a follow-up question? To be continued.
If my questions are relevant, tell me so, but why is this not battled at the universities?
Should we? I mean, it really is a travesty that universities are perpetuating rather than counteracting those tendencies. And I think the answer, again, is cultural, because even if you look at a place like the University of Chicago, which came out #1 in FIRE's surveys and had the great free speech principles, if you talk to people who go to school there, they do the same kind of self-censorship that goes on everywhere else. You know, before a student will speak in class or out of class, saying, is it worth it? The same question that your basketball teammates ask themselves. And so the cultural, I'd say the problem is something that is not susceptible to a solution by an institution. It has to come maybe through programs such as the one Joanne talks about.
Sorry for interrupting before. Enes mentioned earlier, which I thought was such a good point, how does the Chinese government, dominate an American thing like the NBA? And I think a huge issue we face, that Enes knows as well, is the threat of TikTok now. So I wanted to ask you, how do we address the threat of TikTok without violating, our First Amendment, the freedom to receive and freedom of speech information? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I remember, I'm sure you guys know about the spy balloons that we had in our country, and everybody was complaining about that, but no one was really talking about that we had 150 over now, probably 150 million people in America have TikTok on their phone, and pretty much Chinese government is brainwashing our young generation and putting their agenda out there, and it's interesting because to me, I think it should be banned, because there are many young generations out there are being brainwashed by the Chinese government, and if you ever download TikTok on your phone, and now all your data or whatever you talk about is pretty much being watched by the Chinese government, and it is a fact actually, and it's already banned. That app is already banned in people who works at the governments and stuff, but. It's an interesting question. I don't know if I have an answer to that, but already I believe 2 or 3 states ban TikTok. Any of whoever is downloaded, I believe it's a $10,000 fine or something. But I don't know the answer to that, but I'll just say it should definitely be banned in our country.
Hi. In Michigan, we have a Democrat majority in our government, and the House just passed where they're going to make it a felony, 5 years, up to 5 years, and a $10,000 fine for misusing pronouns. Is that an overreach? And I'm sure it'll pass the Senate. Is that overreach, and will that be challenged by the legal?
I changed my pronoun to God and gods before I came in here today, so I prefer if you refer to me as that.
Yeah, so that law, I mean, I do think there's a little bit more to it than just if you use the incorrect pronoun. It has to be intimidating. I actually think, though, even the way the law is written with all those, that language is probably going to be unconstitutional, because it doesn't reach the Supreme Court definition of harassment or true threat. And the Supreme Court actually just came out with a new decision for true threats, like what's actually a threat. Because a true threat is not protected by the First Amendment, but what constitutes a true threat is actually very, very narrow, and the Supreme Court just reaffirmed that this term. And so...
If you make a law, they keep pushing it, then it becomes true after a while.
It's frightening that it even
It's accepted after a while.
Yeah, I would be shocked if that passes, that it won't be challenged, and I would be surprised if the court doesn't find it unconstitutional. I don't know if you disagree, Nikki.
I don't disagree, and we've had a long pattern of politicians actually assuming that the law is going to be struck down. So, for example, when Congress first became aware of the internet, swiftly passed laws to censor it, which virtually nobody voted against on either side of the aisle. The Clinton administration signed the law. The ACLU went to court. It was struck down 9-0. I happened to be testifying in Congress the very next day, and members of Congress who voted for the law came up to me, thank you for getting that struck down. It was a stupid, dangerous law. But we dared not vote against it for fear of being accused of being soft on, you know, child porn, indecency, whatever the political cause of the day is. So it's like we have that First Amendment safety net that we take for granted, I think, and this is one man. But the good news is I think that it won't last.
I'm curious to know if any of you have, and I know a lot of people will be horrified at this suggestion, if any of you read the Kaczynski Manifesto, because he predicts all of this stuff. And you know, if you're shocked by what's happening on colleges right now, you've not been paying attention. I mean, this was written about 30 years ago about what's going on with colleges. I mean, so if any of you read that and seen the predictions there.
I wanted to ask if any of you guys would like to delve deeper into the censorship in media. Media, you know, traditionally you think of media holding government accountable and shining a light on things, and just the opposite seems to be happening these days.
I agree with you to an extent. The extent is regarding the so-called mainstream media, right? But fortunately, there are a lot of alternatives, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so grateful that the internet continues to mostly be free and has provided homes for journalists who have been driven out of so-called mainstream media. It is easier than ever to follow the writers you like and look for perspectives that you find refreshing, to look for a range of viewpoints thanks to the online resources. And contrary to a lot of bad-mouthing about supposed echo chambers and rabbit holes, those who do serious studies of consumer consumption of information say that people who get their news and information online tend to consult more different sources and sources with more different perspectives because it is so easy. So, you know, as an activist, I have to be a congenital optimist, so I'm seeing the glass half full. I am very, very disappointed in sources I used to trust growing up, but I have plenty of alternative sources, and all of us do.
Hi, I guess
I did want to add one more to that, by the way. So imagine producing a 3-hour film series on free speech and how much censorship we had to do in order to get this program on the public television.
And kind of on that note, how do you also deal with implicit versus just like, for example, if you much of the media, left and right, will depend on something like the AP standards for how things are referred to, be it the way one refers to in print to a sex change or to someone who comes across the border, or any number of situations. You have standards that are observed even in much of the partisan press, left and right. And how do you beat even that in trying to preserve free speech and free expression? Is there a way to sort of address or to have perhaps more discourse or better discourse on how we talk about things like this?
I mean, I think you just set me up to be able to say through more speech, right? It's, you know, I think Nadine's right, going to alternative sources. There are a lot out there, and luckily the internet has made it so that everyone currently can have a voice, and I think that that's what's needed. We talked about cultural shift needed to combat cancel culture. I think any of these things we want to combat do require that focusing on a cultural shift and using our First Amendment freedoms in order to be able to do that.
I think of the statements that Yeonmi Park, the young woman from North Korea, was making, and then hooking it back to George Orwell, that if you ban certain words, you're necessarily banning certain ideas. And the United States Supreme Court expressly recognized that in an important case from the early 1970s, where the government was only trying to outlaw the word that then was considered the most taboo word. And I think it's really important for us to remember that historical context. It was the so-called F word. It's not shocking to us now. But to understand the impact of that decision, you have to understand that that word was considered so shocking that the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court ordered the ACLU lawyer who was arguing in defense of his client's right to wear a jacket saying, forgive me, fuck the draft. Chief Justice Berger told the lawyer not to use the word. And he also told Justice John Marshall Harlan, who wrote the opinion, not to use the word in the opinion. So think of what today would be the most taboo word. I think we all would have a candidate for that. The Supreme Court's rationale would apply to that, let alone to, what is the appropriate AP term for referring to various people and so forth. The Supreme Court very strongly said it is a fallacy to believe that you can that you can eliminate a particular word and not also be eliminating an associated idea. So what you're talking about is fine if it's done as a voluntary matter. It could never withstand a First Amendment challenge if it was imposed, for example, at a public university.
You said it perfectly. I think they said it perfect. I couldn't say it in a better word. I learned a lot, so he said it perfectly.
Any final comments from you on this topic? Thought police.
Top police. You know what? I'm going to say it last. You guys go first.
I think that my concern with all of the censorship that's occurring, whether at the government level or the peer-to-peer level, or companies, social media sites, wherever we're getting the censorship, I think it's really important that we focus on, fighting back against that. And I don't think it's just in the courtroom. I do think it's culturally that we need to do that too.
I think that each of us has a special responsibility to be especially vigilant when it is people like us who might be our ideological fellow travelers, who might vote for the same candidate for president and so forth, that we have to be especially vigilant to call them out when they are engaging in peer pressure type of censorship. I found, people will generally be biased in favor of free speech if they happen to agree with the speaker. And I think, therefore, I feel as a political liberal, especially important for me to call out my fellow liberals when they are engaging in cancel culture. And I urge conservatives to do the same thing. It's much too easy for us to criticize the others, and we owe it to free speech to call out our own as well.
Of course. First, she was talking about the cancel culture. We definitely do need to cancel culture. That's one. And two, that we keep talking about free speech. We need to understand that how blessed that we have this in the free speech in this country. Because like Yeonmi Park said, or what's happening in my country, there are many countries out there that don't have that free speech, so we definitely need to be blessed and feel blessed and lucky to be in a situation like this. So that's it.
So we have 2 more panel sessions coming up on free speech. So if anybody has to leave, I did want to point you out to one fact. At 4:35 on the main stage today, you will be able to see Nadine Strauss. And I want to thank Enes Freedom, Nadine Strauss, and Joanne Coop for joining us today on this panel. 10-minute break till next.